The Vietnam War was a long, costly armed conflict. It raged from 1955 to 1975. The war was fought in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The main fighters were North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam was supported by communist allies. South Vietnam was supported by the United States and anti-communist allies. The war was part of a larger Cold War struggle. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a global rivalry. They sought to spread their respective ideologies, capitalism and communism. Vietnam became a proxy war where these superpowers clashed indirectly. The war had a profound impact on all involved. The Vietnam War was a turning point in American history. It divided the nation and sparked widespread protests. The war's legacy continues to shape US foreign policy and society today. The war left a devastating toll on Vietnam. Millions of Vietnamese civilians and soldiers were killed. The country was ravaged by bombs and Agent Orange, a powerful herbicide. The war's physical and psychological scars continue to affect the Vietnamese people. The United States entered the Vietnam War gradually, escalating its involvement over time. The roots of US involvement can be traced back to the domino theory. This theory, popular during the Cold War, held that if one country fell to communism, neighboring countries would follow. The US feared that a communist victory in Vietnam would lead to the spread of communism throughout Southeast Asia. Initially, the US provided financial and military aid to South Vietnam. However, as the conflict intensified, the US began sending combat troops to support the South Vietnamese government. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 marked a major turning point. The incident, which involved alleged attacks on US Navy destroyers by North Vietnamese forces, led to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This resolution authorized President Lyndon B. Johnson to escalate US military involvement in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. The US commitment to South Vietnam grew rapidly. By 1968, there were over 500,000 American troops stationed in Vietnam. The war became increasingly unpopular in the US as casualties mounted. Public opinion turned against the war, fueling a powerful anti-war movement. The Vietnam War was characterized by intense battles and significant turning points. One of the most well-known battles was the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. This decisive battle, which resulted in a French defeat, marked the end of French colonial rule in Vietnam. The Tet Offensive in 1968 was another pivotal moment in the war. This surprise offensive by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces targeted numerous South Vietnamese cities and military installations during the Vietnamese New Year holiday. While the Tet Offensive was a military defeat for the communists, it had a profound psychological impact on the war. It shattered the American public's perception that the US was winning the war. The My Lai massacre in 1968 further eroded public support for the war. This horrific incident, in which US soldiers killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, shocked and outraged the American public. The Christmas bombings of 1972, a massive bombing campaign authorized by President Richard Nixon, also proved to be a turning point. These bombings, while intended to force North Vietnam to negotiate an end to the war, sparked international condemnation and intensified anti-war sentiment in the US. For American soldiers fighting in Vietnam, life was a grueling and dangerous experience. They faced a determined enemy, a harsh jungle environment, and the constant threat of death or injury. Soldiers endured intense combat, often engaging in close-quarters fighting in dense jungles. They faced booby traps, snipers, and ambushes. The psychological toll of war was also significant. Soldiers witnessed horrific violence, lost comrades, and struggled to cope with the trauma of combat. The average age of a soldier in Vietnam was 19, much younger than in previous wars. Many were drafted into service, while others volunteered for patriotic or economic reasons. Upon returning home, many Vietnam veterans faced a hostile public and struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. They suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, physical injuries, and the effects of Agent Orange exposure. Section 5. The Faces of War: Vietnamese Civilians in the Crossfire. The Vietnam War had a devastating impact on Vietnamese civilians. Caught in the crossfire of a brutal war, they endured unimaginable suffering. Millions were killed or wounded, and countless others were displaced from their homes. Villages were destroyed, families were torn apart, and the Vietnamese people faced constant fear and uncertainty. The war's impact on the Vietnamese landscape was profound. Bomb craters, defoliated forests, and contaminated land served as stark reminders of the conflict's destructive legacy. The use of Agent Orange, a powerful herbicide, had long-term health and environmental consequences. Despite the hardships they faced, the Vietnamese people displayed remarkable resilience. They adapted to the challenges of war, supported their communities, and fought for their survival. Section 6. The power of the image, media, and public opinion. The Vietnam War was the first televised war, and the media played a significant role in shaping public opinion. Images of combat, casualties, and protests were broadcast into American homes on a daily basis. The graphic nature of the war footage shocked and horrified many Americans, fueling growing opposition to the war. Journalists played a crucial role in reporting on the war, providing first-hand accounts of the conflict and its impact on both soldiers and civilians. Some journalists were critical of the war effort, challenging the government's narrative and exposing the brutality of the conflict. The media's coverage of the war contributed to the growing credibility gap between the Johnson administration and the American public. As the war dragged on, public trust in the government eroded, and support for the war dwindled. Section 7. A nation divided, protests and social upheaval. The Vietnam War deeply divided American society. As the war escalated and casualties mounted, opposition to the war grew, particularly among students, civil rights activists, and intellectuals. Anti-war protests became a common sight in cities and towns across America. Demonstrators marched, rallied, and engaged in acts of civil disobedience to express their opposition to the war. The anti-war movement was fueled by a variety of factors, including moral outrage over the war's brutality, concerns about the draft, and a belief that the war was unjust. The movement was also influenced by the civil rights movement, as many activists saw parallels between the struggle for racial equality at home and the fight against imperialism abroad. Section 8. The fall of Saigon and the end of the war. By 1973, the United States had withdrawn most of its combat troops from Vietnam. The Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, officially ended U.S. involvement in the war. However, fighting continued between North and South Vietnam. In the spring of 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a final offensive, capturing Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, on April 30, 1975. The fall of Saigon marked the end of the Vietnam War and the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. The war had a profound impact on Vietnam. Millions of Vietnamese were killed, the country was devastated, and the communist victory led to significant political and social changes. Section 9. Scars of War, the lasting impact on veterans. The Vietnam War had a lasting impact on American veterans. Many returned home with physical injuries, psychological scars, and the lingering effects of Agent Orange exposure. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, became a common diagnosis among Vietnam veterans who struggled to cope with the trauma of war. They faced nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, depression, and difficulty adjusting to civilian life. The use of Agent Orange, a powerful herbicide, had long-term health consequences for both Vietnamese and American veterans. Exposure to Agent Orange was linked to various cancers, birth defects, and other health problems. Section 10. Echoes of Vietnam, the war's legacy and lessons learned. The Vietnam War left an enduring legacy on American society and foreign policy. It sparked a national debate about the use of military power, the role of the media in wartime, and the responsibility of citizens to speak out against unjust wars. The war also led to changes in the US military, including an end to the draft and a greater emphasis on professionalization. The Vietnam War serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of American power and the importance of carefully considering the consequences of military intervention. It highlights the need for diplomacy, international cooperation, and a clear understanding of the complexities of war. The lessons of Vietnam continue to shape US foreign policy today, reminding policymakers of the human cost of war and the importance of seeking peaceful solutions to international conflicts.